Welcome to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast, where we like to take a deep dive into the wisdom of Islamic teachings.
Oh, I like that.
So today, we're going to be exploring a topic that might be a little bit unexpected. We're going to be looking at Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 23,
Okay.
Divination and Omens.
Wow, that's an interesting one. It's a topic that's always fascinated me. It kind of touches on this universal human desire to understand the unknown, to get a glimpse into the future or to feel like we have some control over our destiny. It's like we're always searching for those hidden patterns and meanings, trying to make sense of the world around us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think what's particularly fascinating about this book is that it tackles this head on.
Yeah,
It doesn't shy away from these practices. It directly addresses them.
right.
And it offers a very clear Islamic perspective on how we should be approaching these questions.
Mm-hmm. And it's amazing how relevant these teachings are, even today. Like, think about it. We're bombarded with information all the time, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And so much of it is just noise, misinformation, and all sorts of spiritual claims and practices that are kind of floating around. So, yeah, this book is like a breath of fresh air. It cuts through all that clutter and offers some real clarity and guidance.
But before we get into the specifics, can you just give us a little bit of background on Sunan Abu Dawud for those who might not be familiar with it?
Oh, absolutely. So, Sunan Abu Dawud, it's one of the 6 major hadith collections in Sunni Islam.
Right.
And it was compiled by Imam Abu Dawud back in the 9th century. It's basically a treasure trove of thousands of hadiths, which are narrations of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings, his actions, and even his approvals, peace be upon him, of course.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's a really vital source of guidance for Muslims. It helps us understand how to apply Islamic principles to every aspect of our lives.
So in Book 23, we're getting this really unique window into how the early Muslims wrestled with these questions of divination and omens,
Yeah.
and how Islam sought to guide them toward a different way of thinking and understanding the world.
Exactly. And, the beauty of it is that these teachings aren't just confined to history. They speak to us today just as powerfully as they did back then. They offer us a framework for navigating the complexities of our modern world.
Okay. So let's jump right in. The first hadith we encounter in Book 23, hadith number 3895, it sets a pretty strong tone right off the bat.
Okay.
It's a stern warning against going to fortune tellers or believing in their predictions.
Yeah.
And it uses some pretty striking language to emphasize the gravity of this.
It really does. The hadith, it doesn't hold back. It actually puts resorting to divination and believing in those predictions in the same category as some of the most serious sins in Islam.
Wow.
Yeah. It even mentions things like engaging in intercourse during menstruation or anal intercourse. So that just shows you how strongly Islam rejects these practices.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful statement. But why such a strong stance? What is it about divination that Islam finds so problematic?
Well, at the core of it, I think it really boils down to the concept of tawhid, the oneness of God, Allah. It's the foundation of our faith, And this belief, it implies that Allah has absolute power, knowledge, and control over everything. So divination, when you really think about it, it's like trying to circumvent Allah, to gain knowledge or to try to control the future through methods that He hasn't sanctioned.
So it's like you're trying to peek behind the curtain,
Exactly.
into a realm that's meant to be known only to Allah.
Yeah. It's about recognizing our limits, recognizing that we're human and we don't have all the answers, and we're not supposed to. We're supposed to trust in Allah, knowing that He has a plan, even if we don't always understand it in the moment.
It's a humbling thought
It is.
to realize that we're not actually in control of our own destinies.
And this idea, it's emphasized even further in the next hadith, number 3896, where it deals specifically with astrology.
Yes, the zodiac signs. I mean, it's everywhere these days, magazines, websites, even on dating apps, like you were saying.
Exactly. It's like it's become mainstream. Right.
But Islam, it takes a very different view on this.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Hadith 3896 actually puts astrology under the category of magic, which is strictly forbidden in Islam.
Now, that's where things get really interesting. Because we often think of magic as something fantastical, like something out of a fairy tale.
Right.
But in the context of Islam, it has a much deeper and I think even potentially dangerous meaning.
Absolutely. In Islam, magic, it often involves invoking jinn, which are supernatural beings, or attributing power to created things rather than to Allah.
Okay.
So it's basically a way of seeking power and control through means that are outside of Allah's will.
So even something that seems as harmless as, reading your daily horoscope could be seen as venturing into dangerous territory from an Islamic perspective.
Yeah, I think so, because it implies that the position of the stars at the time of your birth somehow influences your personality, your destiny, even your future, right?
Mhm.
And that directly contradicts the Islamic belief that Allah alone determines those things. It's a fascinating contrast to how astrology is presented in popular culture.
Yeah.
It's often packaged as something fun and lighthearted.
Oh, for sure. It's all about self-discovery and
Right.
empowerment. But these hadiths, they really make you question those assumptions, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm curious, there's a story mentioned in Hadith 31897. It involves the Prophet Muhammad,
Okay.
peace be upon him,
Wow.
talking to his companions after rainfall.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering, what's the significance of this story?
Well, I think it really illustrates how crucial it is to attribute everything back to Allah. So the scene is the rain has just fallen, right?
Yeah.
And the prophet, peace be upon him, he asks his companions, "What did your Lord say?" And some of them replied that they've been given rain by Allah's grace and mercy,
Okay.
but others, they said it was because of a certain star.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Yeah.
It's a test of faith, isn't it?
It is. And those who attributed the rain to the star, even though they might not have realized it, they were kind of revealing a lack of trust in Allah as the ultimate provider.
And this reminds me of how often we hear people say things like, oh, I'm having such a bad day because Mercury's in retrograde. It's become such a casual way to explain our struggles.
It has.
But this hadith, it encourages us to look deeper, to recognize Allah's hand in everything.
Right. Both the good and the bad.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've talked about this general prohibition against divination.
Uh-huh.
But the hadiths, they go even further, right? They talk about specific methods that were prevalent in pre-Islamic Arabia.
Oh, yeah. Hadiths 3898 to 3900, they really delve into those specifics.
Yeah.
We see terms like augury from the flight of birds, presomancy, geomancy by drawing lines. It's fascinating.
I'd love to hear you break those down a little bit.
All right, so imagine you're out in the desert and you see a flock of birds suddenly change direction.
Okay.
In some cultures, you might see that as a sign, like an omen of something good or bad about to happen. That's augury.
Good.
Trying to find those messages from the unseen world in the flight patterns of birds.
And presomancy.
Presomancy. Picture this. You've got a handful of stones, or maybe pebbles, and you toss them down, and then you try to predict the future based on how they land. That's presomancy.
Fascinating. And geomancy.
Geomancy, this one is kind of like a more structured way of trying to read the future. Think of it like reading tea leaves, but instead you're making marks on the earth and interpreting the patterns that come up.
So these are all different ways people have tried to divine the future or to gain some kind of hidden knowledge.
Exactly. And the prophet, peace be upon him, he was directly addressing the beliefs and customs of his time.
Right.
These practices, they were deeply rooted in pre-Islamic Arabian society, and he was challenging those beliefs,
Okay.
offering a completely new way of understanding the world, one based on faith, reason, and submission to the will of Allah.
And I think there's a really important exception that's mentioned in Hadith 3900.
Oh, yeah. That's an interesting one.
It says if a prophet practiced a certain form of divination, it would be permissible, but only in the exact manner that he did it.
Right.
And that seems to contradict everything we've been talking about. So what's going on there?
Well, this exception, I think it really underscores the unique position that prophets hold in Islam.
Okay.
They're chosen by Allah. They're divinely inspired, So any action that they take, it's in alignment with his will. It's not something for us to try to imitate.
Gotcha.
It's about recognizing that prophets have this special relationship with Allah.
Okay. So it's more about acknowledging their unique status
Exactly.
than about endorsing the practice itself.
Exactly. It's a crucial distinction, isn't it?
Absolutely. So we've covered divination, astrology, and some pretty specific methods of fortune telling. But what about those more everyday instances of trying to read into things, like taking omens, for example?
Oh, you're talking about tiara.
Yeah. It's something that I think we might encounter in our daily lives without even realizing it. Those little superstitions we hold on to.
Oh, absolutely. And, it's a more subtle form of seeking guidance outside of Allah's will. It's when we start attributing meanings to random events. We think they're carrying hidden messages or that they predict good or bad luck.
Can you give me some examples of what this might look like?
Sure. Think about it. Have you ever felt a little uneasy when a black cat crossed your path? Or maybe you put off a trip because you saw a certain kind of bird and thought it was a bad sign.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely been guilty of that.
We all have. Or like, if you break a mirror, you get this sense of dread. It's those moments where we kind of slip into tiara without even realizing it.
So why is this considered a problem in Islam? Like, is it really such a big deal?
Well, Hadith 39901, it explains that taking omens, it's actually considered a form of shirk.
Shirk. That's a
Yeah.
pretty serious accusation. I always thought shirk was about believing in other gods.
Right. But at its core, shirk is anything that compromises our belief in the oneness of Allah. It's about attributing power to something other than Him. So when we start saying that a black cat or a certain bird can influence our future, we're essentially giving those things power over us. We're implying that they have some kind of control over our destiny.
Right.
And that directly contradicts the Islamic belief that Allah alone has that control.
So even those seemingly small actions, those little superstitions, they can actually chip away at our faith.
Yeah, it's like there are little cracks in the foundation of our belief in Allah's absolute power.
It's a good reminder to be mindful of our thoughts and actions
It is.
and to always reaffirm that belief in Allah's oneness.
It's a continuous process, isn't it?
It is. And, it's comforting that the Hadith acknowledges that we all experience these fleeting thoughts of tiara.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about being perfect. We're human. It's about recognizing those thoughts and gently redirecting our hearts and minds back to Allah.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about that constant striving to purify our hearts, to clear out anything that distracts us from that connection with Allah.
So moving on, it seems like Hadiths 3902 to 3905 take a slightly different approach.
Oh, yeah, they do.
They focus on debunking those superstitions that were prevalent in pre-Islamic Arabia.
Right.
It's almost like a direct attack on those irrational fears and beliefs that were so common at the time.
It is. It's like the Prophet, peace be upon him, was saying, look, let's use our reason here. Let's base our understanding of the world on knowledge and on faith.
Right.
And he was exposing the absurdity of these superstitions.
Can you give us some examples of what those specific superstitions were?
Of course. So, for example, there was this belief that infection spread through supernatural means.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So if somebody fell ill, people would attribute it to evil spirits or to curses instead of understanding how diseases actually spread. The Prophet, peace be upon him, he challenged that. He encouraged people to understand that illnesses have natural causes
Interesting.
and that we should be taking practical steps to prevent them from spreading.
So he was promoting public health awareness centuries ago.
Exactly. He was advocating for a more rational, a more evidence-based understanding of the world, He also addressed this belief in Hama, which was the idea that if you heard an owl or another bird shrieking, it meant the spirit of a deceased person was present.
Oh, wow. So that must have created a lot of fear and anxiety among people.
It did. Imagine hearing an owl hoot in the night and thinking it's the ghost of your departed loved one. It's pretty scary, right?
It would be.
But the Prophet, peace be upon him, he clarified that those are just animals making sounds. They're not ghostly manifestations.
I bet that brought a lot of comfort to people who were living in fear of those supposed spirits.
I'm sure it did. And then there was the superstitions surrounding the month of Safar, which was considered to be unlucky.
Oh,
People would avoid traveling or starting any important tasks during that month
wow.
because they were afraid something bad would happen. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, he declared that there's no such thing as an inherently unlucky month. All months are created by Allah. And associating bad luck with a particular month is just another form of superstition.
So he was essentially saying that we shouldn't be giving power to those arbitrary concepts of time.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that Allah is in control of time.
Right.
And we shouldn't be attributing any negativity to specific periods.
It's interesting how these hadiths tackle very specific beliefs,
Yeah.
but the underlying message is universal, isn't it?
It really is. It's about relying on reason, knowledge, and faith in Allah,
Right.
instead of giving in to those irrational fears and those baseless superstitions that can creep into our minds.
And I think that message is just as relevant today as it was centuries ago.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with all the misinformation that's so readily available. It's more important than ever to cultivate that discerning mind,
Yeah.
to make sure that we're seeking knowledge from authentic sources and that we're grounding ourselves in the truth of our faith.
And these hadiths,
Yeah,
they offer us a framework for navigating the complexities of the world.
they do. They're like a toolkit.
Right. For separating fact from fiction.
Picture.
And really for understanding what's truly beneficial for us and what's harmful.
And it's not just about avoiding the negative, it's also about embracing the positive, right?
Oh, absolutely. Islam doesn't want us to live in a state of constant fear,
Right.
always on guard against the bad stuff. It encourages us to seek out good signs and to focus on good thoughts.
Exactly. Islam is a religion of hope and optimism, you know. It wants us to see the good in everything and to be grateful for all the blessings that Allah has given us.
So there's a balance.
There is. And Hadith 3906 and 3907, they actually highlight the Prophet's appreciation for good omens.
Okay.
He called them good words. He understood the power of positive thinking, and he encouraged people to speak those good things into existence.
You know, I love that.
It's a beautiful concept.
It's a reminder to look for the silver lining in every cloud.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to focus on the good, even when things are tough.
And to cultivate that sense of gratitude and hope.
It's about recognizing that we have a choice in how we see the world. We can choose to focus on the negative,
Right.
or we can choose to focus on the positive.
And I think that's a really empowering message.
It is, and it reminds us that even our thoughts and our words, they have power. They can shape our reality.
Now, what about those times when we do encounter things we dislike or experience negative thoughts? How does Islam guide us in dealing with those moments?
Well, Hadith 3909 offers a really powerful tool for those times, supplication. It reminds us to turn to Allah in prayer, to acknowledge that He is in control, and to seek His protection from harm.
Can you share the specific prayer mentioned in this hadith?
Absolutely. The prayer is, O Allah, no one brings good things except Thee, and no one averts evil things except Thee, and there is no might and power but in Allah.
Wow, that's a beautiful prayer.
It is.
It's so simple, but so powerful.
Yeah. And it's a reminder that even when we're struggling, when we're feeling overwhelmed by those negative thoughts, our ultimate reliance should be on Allah.
So even though Islam discourages things like divination and taking omens, it gives us these really practical and empowering ways to face life's challenges.
It does, and to maintain that positive outlook.
Exactly. It's almost like Allah is saying, don't worry, I've got you, just trust me.
It's about replacing that fear and uncertainty with faith and reliance on His wisdom and His mercy.
And that trust is something that we cultivate
It is.
over time through these practices.
It's a journey.
It is.
And this deep dive, it's been so enlightening.
It has. It's amazing how much guidance is packed into these hadiths. They really offer a timeless roadmap for navigating life
They do.
and for making sense of the world around us.
It's for strengthening our connection with Allah, right?
Absolutely.
And you know, we've really only scratched the surface.
We have. There's so much more to explore in Book 23. So many more lessons to uncover.
I can't wait to dive into the next set of hadiths with you.
Me too.
Yeah.
Let's see what other wisdom we can find.
You know, it's interesting. Even Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you know, he had certain preferences when it came to names and places.
Really?
Yeah, so Hadith 3910, it mentions that before sending out like an agent or before going into a village, he would ask about the name.
Oh, wow. So was he taking omens then?
Not exactly. The Hadith explains that he just, you know, he liked names with good meanings, positive connotations.
Okay.
So if a name sounded pleasing to him, you know, he would express that. And if he didn't like it, that would be pretty obvious too. It was more of a personal preference, not like a religious obligation or anything.
So how do we reconcile that with the really strong warnings against seeking omens that we were talking about before? It seems a bit like a gray area, doesn't it?
It does,
Yep.
but it's important to remember that everything the prophet did, peace be upon him, it was guided by divine revelation. So his personal preferences, they wouldn't go against what Allah had commanded.
Right.
This hadith, it's just showing us another side of the prophet, you know? It's a reminder that even the most pious individuals, they're human. They have their own likes and dislikes.
I see. So it's about finding that balance between our human nature and our spiritual aspirations.
Exactly. It's about striving to align our hearts with Allah's will and to seek His guidance in everything.
Okay. Let's move on to Hadith 3911. This one is a bit of a head-scratcher. It says that if there is an evil omen in anything, it's in a house, a horse, and a woman.
That one always makes people stop and think, doesn't it?
It does. It sounds almost like a riddle. What's the meaning behind that?
Well, we have to be careful not to take this literally, you know? It's not saying that houses, horses, and women are bad in and of themselves. It's more about being aware of the potential challenges that can come with them.
So can you break that down for us? What are those potential challenges?
Sure. So think about a house. It represents security, stability, you know, but it can also be a source of conflict if it's not well maintained or if people living there aren't getting along. Imagine like a family living in a really cramped and rundown house. constantly arguing, struggling to make ends meet.
I see.
That house becomes a source of stress instead of a source of peace.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about the
Uh,
horse? Why is that included?
Well, back then, horses were super valuable. They
Hmm.
were symbols of wealth and status.
Right.
They were essential for transportation, warfare.
Right.
But horses can also be dangerous,
Yeah.
if you don't know how to handle them
Well, it
properly.
can be unpredictable.
Exactly. They can get spooked easily. It takes a lot of skill to control them. So the hadith is reminding us to be cautious, even with things that seem beneficial on the surface.
To be mindful of the potential risks.
Exactly. And then there's the mention of women.
Okay. This is where it gets a bit tricky, right? Because this hadith has been interpreted in some pretty negative ways about women.
It has, unfortunately. But that's a misinterpretation, It's not about women themselves being bad omens.
So how should we understand this part?
Well, we have to consider the historical context. In pre-Islamic Arabia, women, they were often marginalized.
Right.
Their voices weren't heard.
The rights were often denied.
Exactly. So the hadith, it's pointing to the potential for harm that can come from those societal conditions, from the way women were treated and perceived at the time.
I see. So it's not about women themselves being the problem.
No.
It's about the problems that arose from the way society treated them.
Exactly. And when you understand it that way, the hadith is actually calling for justice, for treating women with respect and dignity.
Right.
It's a reminder that healthy relationships, they need mutual respect, understanding, communication.
It's about building those strong foundations.
Yes. And being mindful of the complexities that can arise in any relationship.
So it's a reminder to approach those areas of life with wisdom and caution.
And with a sincere desire to do what's right.
I think what's really striking about these hadiths is this emphasis on balance.
Mm-hmm. It comes up again and again, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It's about finding that middle ground between extremes, not being too reckless, but also not being overly cautious.
Right. It's about embracing our human nature while striving for that spiritual excellence.
And Islam is all about that balance, isn't it?
It is. It's about recognizing that we're human, but we're also capable of great things.
Right.
It's about refining ourselves, aligning our actions with Allah's will,
It's that constant striving to be better.
It's a lifelong journey, isn't it?
It is. So let's talk about the last set of hadiths in Book 23, Numbers 3912 to 3914:1. They seem to offer some pretty practical advice.
They do. It's almost like a guide to risk management.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So how do these hadiths help us navigate those potential risks in life?
Well, they remind us that while we should always trust in Allah,
Mm-hmm.
He also expects us to use our common sense to take practical steps to avoid harm.
So it's about finding that balance between trust and action.
Exactly. It's
Oh.
not about just passively accepting whatever happens. It's about being proactive, using our intellect
Right.
to make smart decisions.
Okay. Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. So, Hadith 3912, it talks about leaving a place that's known for disease.
Oh, okay.
Specifically, it mentions Abiyan, which was a region that was notorious for its unhealthy environment. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, he advised people to leave that area.
So he was basically saying, get out of there before you get sick.
Exactly. It's common sense, right?
It is.
We don't just sit around and wait for things to happen to us. We take precautions. We watch our hands. We eat healthy food. We avoid dangerous places. And at the same time, we trust that Allah will protect us.
It's a partnership between our efforts and Allah's will.
Exactly.
And Hadith 3913, it seems to build on this idea of taking action to improve our situation.
It does. This hadith advises against staying in a place where you're experiencing hardship.
So it could be a place with natural disasters or maybe just a really toxic environment.
Right. The point is that we're not meant to just sit and suffer if we have options.
We have the power to make changes.
We do. We can try to create a better life for ourselves, for our families.
It's a reminder that we have agency within Allah's will.
I love that. It's about recognizing our potential and using it to make a positive difference.
And finally, there's Hadith 3914.
Oh, this is a beautiful one.
It is. It talks about the Prophet, peace be upon him, taking a man with leprosy by the hand and sharing a meal with him.
It's such a powerful image, isn't it?
It is. So how do we balance this idea of compassion with the need to protect ourselves and others from disease?
Well, we have to remember the context. Back then, leprosy was a very stigmatized disease.
Right.
People were terrified of it. They thought it was contagious and incurable. And those who had it were often treated like outcasts.
And the Prophet, peace be upon him, he challenged that stigma.
He did. He showed compassion and empathy. He reached out to this man, touched him, shared a meal with him, and reassured him that Allah was with him.
That must have been so powerful for that man.
It must have been. And for those who witnessed it.
It was a lesson in how to treat others with kindness and dignity, no matter their circumstances.
Exactly. It really was a beautiful demonstration of compassion, wasn't it?
It was, and it's such a challenging concept for us to grapple with. How do we balance this compassion and desire to help those who are suffering with the warnings about, being careful about contact and protecting ourselves and others from disease?
It's tricky, right? I think it's about understanding the context of each situation. In this specific hadith, the Prophet, peace be upon him, he wasn't saying to disregard public health advice. It was more about showing that our connection to Allah should be stronger than any social barriers. Compassion and empathy should guide our interactions with everyone, regardless of their situation.
So it's about finding that balance between taking precautions to protect ourselves and others from physical harm, while also extending kindness and empathy to those who are in need.
Yeah, exactly. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstances.
Right. It's about seeing each other through the lens of compassion, not fear. Recognizing that we're all going through something, and we should approach each other with kindness and empathy, a genuine desire to help.
I like that. I think these hadiths really highlight that faith isn't just about rituals or beliefs. It's about action, making choices that reflect our values and living in a way that embodies the mercy and compassion of Allah.
Absolutely. And they remind us to use our intellect and our resources to actually create that positive change in our lives and in the world around us.
Yeah. I mean, it's been such a fascinating journey going through these ancient texts and uncovering this wisdom that is just as relevant today as it was centuries ago.
It really is. They offer us like a timeless roadmap for navigating the ups and downs of life, making sense of everything around us, and getting closer to Allah.
I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, though.
Oh, for sure. There's so much more we could explore in Book 23.
There are endless lessons to be learned.
I think what's really struck me is how important intention is.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just about avoiding certain actions. It's about understanding the motivations behind them, like the subtle ways we try to grasp for control or certainty outside of Allah.
You're absolutely right. It's about constantly being mindful of our thoughts and actions and making sure they're in line with Allah's will.
And recognizing that true peace and guidance come from submitting to His plan, not from trying to predict or control the future in ways that He's forbidden.
It's like this ongoing tug of war, isn't it?
It is.
We're constantly being pulled in two directions. One towards Allah, towards surrender and trust, and the other towards our own desires and ego that need to be in control, to know everything, to feel secure.
In this book, this exploration of divination and omens, it's like a training manual for strengthening those spiritual muscles that pull us towards Allah.
That's a powerful image. It's about checking in with ourselves and asking, where am I putting my trust? Am I seeking knowledge from the right sources? Am I relying on my limited understanding, or am I surrendering to the one who truly knows best?
And I think that raises a really important question for all of us. Are there areas in our lives where we're maybe unknowingly doing things that contradict Islamic teachings? Things that might seem harmless on the surface, but that are actually taking us further away from Allah?
It's something we should all reflect on. Maybe we're checking our horoscope every day, even if we say it's just for fun.
Right.
Or letting superstitions affect our decisions without even realizing it.
Or even obsessing over good omens, thinking they guarantee success or happiness, and shifting our trust from Allah to those external signs.
It's so subtle how we fall into these patterns.
It is. And that's why this deep dive has been so valuable.
Yeah.
It's a reminder to examine those beliefs and habits, to catch ourselves when we stray from the right path, and to make a conscious effort to come back.
It's like we're doing this ongoing spiritual inventory.
I like that.
Yeah. Looking for any cracks in the foundation of our faith, any leaks that need to be repaired.
Exactly. And when we find those cracks, we don't despair. We turn to Allah for forgiveness, guidance, and strength to make our hearts whole again.
Beautifully said.
It's that continuous journey of getting closer to Allah and living in accordance with His guidance.
Absolutely. And knowledge is only beneficial when we act on it, right?
Exactly. So let this deep dive into Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 23, be a reminder to actually implement these lessons into our lives.
Yes.
May it inspire us to strengthen our connection with Allah, trust in His wisdom, and seek His guidance in everything.
And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 23, Divination and Omens. May Allah grant us all understanding and strength to live according to His will.
And to find that true peace and contentment that comes from being in His presence. Until next time.
May Allah guide us all towards truth and righteousness.